Welcome to another episode of Infographic Instant. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the question of whether customs agencies show signs of grouping into convergence clubs. Before looking at the infographic, we should talk a little bit about convergence clubs. Convergence clubs relate to a group of countries that exhibit similar tendencies based on some underlying variables. So, for example, the US, Eastern Europe, and developed Asia, they converge in terms of GDP or other variables for a number of reasons which we won't get into in this infographic. I think to understand the infographic, though, what you need to keep in mind is that countries do not grow in GDP or in customs efficiency or in other ways linearly. In other words, we cannot say that France is 3/4 of the way to US levels. Instead, countries clump together or they move in quanta depending on a number of variables which we discuss in the paper. So, with this background, let's look at the infographic. We've used our statistical analysis to identify 3 convergence clubs. And these convergence clubs, they group countries based on similarities of 3 variables that we've been talking about throughout this series. Namely, first, control of corruption and fight against corruption in customs. Second, the extent of trade facilitation. And third, administrative development of the customs administration itself. So looking at the map, we see that there's a convergence club for China, Japan, Canada, Argentina, and we've labeled that as Green Convergence Club because of relatively high values of each of the 3 variables that we've been discussing. We see a middle range convergence club, Russia, Mongolia, India, Pakistan, etc. And that's labeled in yellow because of the medium level of the variables we've been discussing. And finally, we see a red convergence club, which is Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Algeria, Morocco, and other countries which you can see for yourself. Now, the statistics we used to identify these clubs, it was based on an impartial process. In other words, we didn't use any of our own judgment in order to color the infographic you see in front of you. We used a process known as K-clustering, and we simply asked the software to group different countries based on similarities in variances in the variables of control against corruption, trade facilitation, and administrative capacity. So what you see in front of you is simply a statistical grouping of variances and in no way reflects our own individual judgments. So stepping back for a moment, what does this mean for the reform of customs administrations around the world? Well, as we argue in the paper, particularly for the red group or red convergence club, these customs administrations will require a big bang reform much more than any other customs administration. And by knowing that they fall into this group, hopefully customs directors and the politicians which allocate resources to them can prepare for this big push, hopefully to move some of these customs administrations from the red zone convergence club into a yellow or green convergence club. This has been an infographic instance with Brian Michael.